All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Sacramental Charismatic podcast. I am your host, Luke Garrity, along with the co-host, guest, specialist, Wes McLachlan. Wes, how are you doing?
Good. I'm doing good. I'm doing good. How are you?
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I'm in Northern California. You're in Southern Canada, up there in Vancouver,
That's right.
Washington.
Yeah. Vancouver, Washington.
How's the weather up there?
It's in the 60s.
Nice. Okay. Well, here in Northern California, we have entered into the cooler times as well, so it's wonderful. I love it.
What are you guys at right now?
I think it's like 54 right now, something like that.
What?
Yeah, it's nice.
Jeez.
Yeah, it'll warm up, I'm sure. It'll be in the 70s by this afternoon. But
yeah.
But I just
Sweet.
got back from Alaska, so it was nice and cold up there, and it's kind of nice to be back to where it's a little bit more tolerable. But so this season, third season of the Sacramental Charismatic, you and I have committed to laying out somewhat of a course on how to become a Sacramental Charismatic. We took 2 months off since the last episode.
Is that what we're calling it?
Or maybe was it? But yeah, maybe it was 3 months. Maybe it was 3 months. I don't even know. Because we both had, we had mental health issues. That's
what we're talking about too.
Yeah. I mean,
gosh.
we shouldn't joke about that because we both think that is a real issue. But it is kind of interesting how everybody has mental health issues. That's my assumption most times now. I'm assuming that you're probably struggling with your mental and emotional state. So
anxiety.
It's okay. Yeah, I'm like, drink some more coffee. You're gonna power through. That's the Gen X in me, though. So you're a millennial, so you don't believe in coffee. You believe in pour-overs.
That's true. Yeah. I have my subscription to a real coffee company that gets delivered to my house every 3 weeks.
Exactly.
So I take coffee very seriously. But it's the same thing. It's like we always get derided over avocado and toast. And I'm like, I'm sorry, we introduced a delicious meal to the world. Like, I apologize.
Yeah. I know, it's interesting because all the Gen Xers are like, yeah, we were force-fed avocados when we were children and we hate it now. Oh, that's just me.
That's just you.
Yeah. So, so last episode, we kind of just traced out a little bit about I think we kind of talked about what is a Sacramental Charismatic and why it was, and maybe even, I think I feel like we talked a little bit about our own personal journeys.
Mm-hmm.
You came from I guess I'm going to summarize your life and then you can summarize mine. Okay.
Okay. Cool.
You came from New Zealand, not New Zealand, South Africa.
At least you didn't say Australia.
I know. I was just thinking about the New Zealand vineyard folks that I've been working with.
Yeah.
No, you came from South Africa. You're kind of in a Pentecostal environment, and then when you were younger, you stumbled into the vineyard, and you've been in the vineyard for a long time now, similar to myself, and so you kind of had would you say Pentecostal evangelical, background?
Yeah.
And then you started studying theology and kind of stumbled into the sacramental tapestry. And from there, it's been one small step towards becoming more and more sacramental as
pretty
you go.
much.
Pretty much it. Okay.
I thought you were going to say Anglican for a second there.
No. That's for a future episode.
That's for a future episode.
We both come out as Anglican priests.
Anglican priests love it.
Yeah. Well, they have us.
Yeah. Todd has a secret line for vineyard folk.
Does he?
No. Probably. Okay, so you also grew up in the vineyard. I know that much. Mostly in the vineyard, and then you also studied theology, went to school for it, and then also came across. But you went to more reformed. I think you were more reformed for a little bit there, and then you were and then you were even like complementarian and probably
I
still am.
was. I know.
And
my wife is pastoring with me, and I don't know how to handle it. Yeah.
And then you sort of also discovered the sacramental stuff through your studies, right? That was the primary way.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading your
that's a good way to
thesis,
say
actually.
it. Yeah. I mean, I ended up writing a thesis on sacramental theology. So
in the vineyard too, like in a vineyard context.
Yeah. On my first master's, on my MDiv, that's where I kind of started having in the Reformed tradition, I don't think the Reformed tradition would consider itself. It would use the word sacramental a whole lot to describe itself, because it would then need to spend so much time saying what it's not.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it's got a lot of concerns about Roman Catholic sacramentality, but it definitely holds to. I mean, Calvin's view of the Eucharist is essentially the one that I hold to, which is a spiritual real presence. And so, I think that's where I kind of had shots fired over my bow, where it's like, wow, there's something more to the world we live in. Matter matters, that there's means to experience grace, which really, to be honest, I think those roots had been planted, those seeds had been planted, those roots had kind of dug in a little bit just through my experience in the vineyard due to our theology of healing. I mean, we in worship, right? I mean, our theology of worship is about as sacramental as it gets. It's a way to encounter God or experience God's grace, or to, so that's kind of how, we both, it's kind of funny because we both had these journeys going along to where we were discovering and encountering sacramental theology and seeing it as a helpful resource. And then we met each other. You joined our staff here, and then made the terrible decision to leave.
To move up to the Southern Calendar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're now Canadian, so.
And now I'm Canadian.
Mm-hmm. So so you wrote a piece though recently that I saw. Well, a post. It had exactly 472 words. Just kidding. I have no idea how many words it is, but
that much.
But this is what you said. And then you said, I wanted to give an update on our journey as a church doing weekly communion, and wanted to list seven few ways that it has benefited us as a church. And then you gave 7. And I thought that'd be a kind of a fun thing to talk about on the podcast, because I think it is kind of cool that you're using the word journey, because I think becoming a sacramental, charismatic church or person is a journey. And I think maybe we should even flesh that out for a minute too, because in the last episode, I think we both suggested that the worst thing possible for somebody to do is to just jump in with both feet and become it and make their whole church start doing litanies next Sunday, with no previous preparation. So talk to me about that. Why'd you use that word journey?
I guess because like exactly what you said, I think it also mimics our, Sundays are not a final destination in my understanding of what it means to be the church. Sunday gatherings are not supposed to be this thing where everything's sorted and everything is complete. I don't think that sort of mimics the now and the not yet of the kingdom. And if anyway, Sundays are just a place where we gather as disciples that are on a journey of following Jesus. And so it very much is mimicking that idea. And so when we introduced communion every week in the church, we knew from the get-go that it was going to be bumpy. It's not going to be a smooth ride from the get-go, and that we were going to change and refine it as we moved and saw how the church was responding to it and how we were responding to it. And that's why I chose the word a journey, is because it's going to involve changes and it's going to involve attunements and all of that kind of stuff to the way we do it. So that's why I chose the word journey.
That's kind of like the word liturgy. I mean, in some ways, it kind of sounds similar to a journey of work, through the worship service, the elements of a journey. changed. So that's good. Okay.
Yeah.
So your journey, how long is your church previously did communion, received communion, celebrated communion, taken communion? Those are all words that I do not how often? What was the regular?
Just give context, I'm at the Vancouver Vineyard Church, just so everyone has like some idea of what church I'm in now. So I'm in the Vancouver Vineyard Church, and we were doing it monthly, and then at the beginning of the year we made the decision to switch over to weekly communion. Yeah. So since the beginning of the year we've been doing this.
monthly and then for the
which I think is most vineyard churches, I would say, right? I think that's the most normal.
I don't know. Yeah, that's
I don't know. Yeah.
I wish that would be included on the census that they do. I wish that'd be more than the questions that they actually ask. Yeah, it would be interesting to know, because I feel like there's more and more, although I guess, I don't know, there's like 500 and a handful of more churches. But yeah, I think you're probably right. I think monthly is probably the standard, but I think there's a lot of vineyards that have been transitioning to do it the biblical way. See what I did there?
I did see that. Yeah. Good job.
Real subtle. Yeah. No, I think that's probably more common now, is to have weekly. I mean, like, I'm surprised at how many people I hear from people all the time of like, hey, you guys really helped us out, getting to the point where we did it weekly, which is pretty cool. I think. So, yeah. So for the last 10 months now, you all have been doing it weekly. That's cool. Okay. Yeah. So, so why don't, if you wouldn't mind, you talked about how it's benefited you. So why don't we go through the 7 things that you wrote, and then at the end of it, I'd love to also, if we can remember to do this, talk about maybe some ways that it's, because the word benefit's an interesting word. I think that's very vineyard, the pragmatic, what works, why it's a blessing. Yeah. But maybe let's talk about what's been challenging about it, just so people can think about that. So what's number 1? You don't even know. You don't even know. You write things. You write
you're pulling it up. So.
Well, I can read it if you want me to.
Okay, I've got it right there. So
okay, go for it. Oh, you're like, oh, I don't know. Hold on.
Okay, so I said it's enriched our praise portion of the service and has anchored it. Being led to Jesus's table is way better than breaking awkwardly for a couple of minutes before announcements. So the way our service, and I think this is most vineyards, is we do praise portion of our worship service, and then you break for like a minute or 30 seconds or whatever it is, or you go straight into announcements. That seems to be a typical thing. So I think it's, I say the word anchored because it feels like it is more meaningful to end our praise portion of the service being led to Jesus's table. And receiving God's grace in both, like, and this is also a good vineyard thing, like both in our praises in spirits and then in a material way through food and drink. And so we're recognizing that, God's creation is good, and that specifically through bread and wine or bread and juice, that we recognize that he is at work in that too. So I really like that a part of it, and I think it's been really good for us.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you use the word anchor as a which is kind of a theological term, I think. A liturgical concept. So tell me this. When you say it's enriched your praise, how does it enrich it? I mean, like, how can you? If you were, I don't even know how you quantify that or how do you measure that, but how would you measure your congregation in its praise enrichment? Do you have a meter in your church? Do you have a way of? If you guys can shout just a little bit louder, we'll know. What is it?
I can't, like, this is subjective, but also the feedback that we've gotten has people overwhelmingly have come and said they so they so much prefer going and having communion after praise and worship than going to the break. And so that's a lot of it has been through feedback that we've gotten from people. The overwhelming response has been people way much more enjoy being centered through song and then centered in the gospel, because the gospel is being presented at the table essentially. And so they were being reminded as we experience this high through praise, sometimes that can often happen. We're also being reminded of the fact that this is tethered to Jesus' story at the table. And so I think that's how it's enriched it. It's almost is a more fuller story of what we're doing together.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. I think that I love how you say, being led to Jesus' table is way better than breaking awkwardly for a couple of minutes before announcements. So because I agree with that. I also think that kind of speaks to the whole design of liturgy though, right? Because when you were part of our church too, we spent a lot of time thinking about the order of service that we had and the way that we would transition, right? Because it seems like, yeah, you go to I've always found that interesting how you're at a church service and it's like, yeah, this really intimate worship. And then all of a sudden it's like, I don't know what just happened. We're now,
now we're like saying hi to someone and doing small talk with someone or something.
I don't know. So like we would use the idea, you and I've talked about having hard left turns or hard right turns, where you want to have a transition, right? So transitioning out of worship, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And you talk a little bit about litanies in a minute here in number 5, so we'll get to that. But I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can transition out of worship and not have it be like this really super awkward, transition. So I think that's a good thing for anybody who's taking note to listen to. So, okay, number 2.
Yeah. So number 2, it's provided a space for people to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. So this has been something where we haven't done as much, but it's something that we're going to start doing more of. And it's going to be a place where we vocally say, if you've never followed Jesus for the first time, you are welcome to decide to follow him for the first time by coming and receiving his grace at the table. So that's going to, that will definitely be something for a future episode, like you said, about our theology of having an open table. But I think that is one space in which, because the two spaces, the main space that someone's been invited to follow Jesus for the first time is after the sermon, right? During ministry time or something. That tends to be but if you are doing the table in the middle of the service, that can be a space where you invite people to follow Jesus for the first time. Because, like I said, the gospel is being presented at the table. People are hearing about Jesus and his story, and that they can decide to follow him. So we've admittedly only done that a couple of times, but it's something that I've definitely want to focus on. And this is like the attunements as we continue on our journey. Yeah.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Number 2. So have you had responses as you've
so far I only know of one person that has told me that because of that they have decided to follow Jesus. So I've gotten one known response to that, and I think, and that was a little while back, but I do know that we're entering in the phases of the church where we're starting to get new people again after the COVID. So I do know that I think if we make more invitational spaces, we will get more responses. I'm almost certain of that. So
that's great. Yeah, that's great. No, I think that's we're definitely going to spend some time talking about our approach. Because it's really, I think our approach to what's called open table, comes from our sacramental theology, right? I mean, it's a direct result of the conclusion that we have about what sacramental theology is. Like if the table is a means of experiencing God's grace, my natural question has always been, well, why would we prevent anybody from wanting to do that? I think we've been practicing. I read this book. I think I have it somewhere around here, but years ago. It's called Forgotten Power by William de Ortega, I think is his name.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think I might have mentioned it to you, or you might have read it. But he, the book starts out with this story of the Eucharist in Episcopalian, an Anglican communion church that's charismatic, and they have this outpouring of the Spirit, and all this charismatic stuff happens around the Lord's table. And then what's interesting is it goes through and traces the lineage of the tables used during the Second Great Awakening and how it was a prominent feature in gospel proclamation. So it was a means of inviting people to Jesus. And so I think I read it like maybe 10 years, 12 years ago, something like that.
Okay.
Maybe 15 now. But so for about 10 to 15 years, somewhere around there, maybe 12, that's become a in the back of my brain, every time we receive, I have this idea of like, this is an opportunity for people to potentially make a decision for the first time. Yeah. And I want to say that in the last 12 years, I mean, dozens of people have made first time decisions to follow Jesus during the Eucharist, So for me, that fruit's been so well established that it'd be, like crazy not to see that as an opportunity, which is always why I find it interesting when people, it's like, we don't want to receive communion too often. It's become so boring and rote then. It's like, the beauty of the Eucharist is it's an opportunity every single time. So I love that. Okay. So number 3, I love number 3.
Number 3 has been probably our best response in terms of the church loving this the most, has been when we've had youth and, among them, but like last weekend we had 2 youth lead us in communion, and in terms of like, did it go really smoothly? No, it did not. But the overall response from people was just like, people just love being led by youth. And I think this also is really fitting in our theology of the Vineyard, in saying that anyone, like kids, can receive something from God and say it, and so God can use children, God can be with children. And I was just like, well, that makes sense that they could lead us in communion too,
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's everyone gets to play, right?
Everyone gets to play. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of that, maybe this is where our approach to sacramental theology is chastened a bit by our pneumatology and our ecclesiology, or vice versa. Because, in some traditions that are sacramental, only priests can lead communion, right?
Yeah.
And that is for me probably the only significant issue that I am unable yet to be convinced of, and why I'm not Anglican.
Yeah,
to be completely honest.
Yeah,
I just that ecclesiological commitment is just tough for me to grasp in light of Scripture. Yeah, the apostolic succession approach, which every Anglican I know is like, I can get there, but I just think that's the one. That's the one that just seems like such a stretch, and I think the drawback, not only theologically can I I kind of can follow the argument, but it just seems to be a problem when it comes to empowering the church, the congregation. But so I really value that, that this vineyard value, going back to Wimber and the early vineyard folks, is everybody gets to play, and so I think that kind of is why we would be less centralized on pastors or clergy members leading the Eucharist, right? And would see it as an opportunity for everybody to serve. But the other side of that too is I think it's a good pipeline. I've been kind of mulling over this challenge that we have about leadership development in the Vineyard. Like, I don't think I know Rich Nathan has done a lot of preaching prep stuff. He's put out courses, but I don't think the Vineyard's really good at preaching. Give me your comments on that.
Okay, so tell me what you're thinking about, like how this is linked to what we're talking about, like in terms of preaching.
He won't take my bait. He won't comment on vineyard preaching. I don't think we are very good at preaching.
Yeah.
In the vineyard, like just by and large. And I mean that about myself. We're not, it's not our thing. We're like, we speak from the heart.
From the heart, let the Spirit take over and and try to think of a really good story.
Yeah, like what story do I got? I got no more stories. So anyway, what I mean by that is when you think about trying to develop preachers, though, or speakers, there's a number of different spaces that you can develop people in, right? So like the typical seminary experiences, ship them off to a seminary. They take a couple homiletics courses and they learn the mechanics of preaching and they do it a little bit. And then they come back and they preach in the church and it's a train wreck. I mean, I have had, it is, it's like, I mean, I'm talking about myself. I remember I started senior pastoring when I was like in my last year, my MDiv. And I was like, man, I'm going to let these people know everything I know. You know, like every, I look at the notes down. I'm like New Testament theology discourse lectures, you know? And it's just my observation of seminarians and newly trained preachers is that it's rough, you know, and understandably, right. They need to get the experience. But so the problem is that oftentimes the negative drawback is on the church, right? Because the church has to sit through 35 to 55 minutes of the most boring information ever with very little practical application. So I think, you know, maybe another approach or perhaps a better approach would be seminary is great. I'm not at all an anti-seminary person. But in addition to that, or in conjunction with that, I think we need to have different pipelines or spaces for people to be developing their ability to speak. I'm a firm believer in shorter is better, especially when you're first starting. So giving someone a 35-minute slot to fill is maybe going to be not the best way to get people to become more comfortable speaking in front of people, as well as to develop that rhythm and skill and gift, right? So leading the Eucharist is one of those spaces where it's like, hey, you have 5 minutes. I want you to prepare. You can kind of coach them along. We have a set of guidelines we give everybody who leads communion in our church that just kind of helps them do it. And that's been a really fruitful way for us to develop speakers, I guess. So that's kind of what I was thinking of when I read number 3.
No, I didn't put this in the list because I didn't want it to come across like the Eucharist should be used for this, but we've had 2 preachers.
Why not? Why not?
Well, now I'm just thinking, now that you're talking about it, but we've had 2 people who have led communion that because of the way they led communion, we went, oh, they would be fantastic preachers.
Yeah.
And then what they did was they led communion again before they preached. So we have used communion as a way for people to be more prepared and comfortable on stage teaching or preaching. And like you said, like you're forced to boil down a point, your big picture or whatever you want to say in 5 minutes, and you have to do that. And that's what preaching is, essentially. So,
it helps preachers develop to understand that you can't do 85 points in a sermon. So that's what I like about it too. And maybe even too, because I know we keep saying, or we're using the language of used, like, oh, we use the Eucharist to, I think maybe a better, more theologically astute way of saying it is that the Eucharist space serves to accomplish a lot of different things, right? In addition to serving, to lead us to Jesus and to help us to experience God's presence, it also serves to be a context to develop people who may be able to step into the role of preaching or teaching, So I really like that you have kids and youth lead us in that, that's something we have not done as often. I've asked a few youth to do it. They're like, no way, never, in a million years.
Get me away from that. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean that was to youth, and I think they were the only two that were willing to do it. So yeah, there is that component.
That's great.
Like,
That's great that you did it.
Yeah.
Sean, our youth pastor, led it. I think it was last week. Was it 2 weeks ago? Yeah, it's 2 weeks ago, and just did a great job. And that's what I think is really beautiful about it too, is because this goes into 3 and 4. We'll move on to 4 in a second here, but it just it's like when you hear other people, like I lead communion a lot. I lead the Eucharist in our church a lot. And it's one of those things that I hope till my dying day, I'm able to be a part of. But it's nice hearing other voices because you hear other stories that are anchored to Jesus that are unique to those people speaking. And so, I mean, Sean did such a great job. I was like, man, he's just, it was really great. So number 4, tell us number 4. So far you've said number 1, it's enriched your praise portion. It leads people to Jesus. Number 2, you said it provides a space for people to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. Number 3, you've said you've had kids and youth lead in communion. So what's number 4?
So number 4 is, following with that, it's provided a space for different languages to be spoken. So far, we're the only other language we've done it in is
Let
Spanish.
Me guess.
Spanish. Oh. Yeah. What? Oh, Afrikaans. What?
Is it? No. No, I was just going to say you probably just, every time you need any diversity, you're like, where's my wife at? Is she?
Well, she did happen to lead it, yeah.
Okay. So for those of you listening or viewing this, Wes's wife, who, I mean, I basically delivered to him. Okay. I'm just going to say, I said, hey, this is Wes. I said, this is Irene. They fell in love, but she is the most amazing human ever, and also a Latina, speaks Spanish fluently. When she left our church, it really hurt. Wes was like, oh, bye, Wes. No, Irene, you're staying, right? So,
yeah. When we were dating, Luke joked, and he was like, just so you know, if you guys break up, we're keeping Irene.
True story.
Oh gosh. But yeah, so we did, I think Irene, the portion she prayed in Spanish during communion, and I mean, people were crying. What was funny was it was like the white people were crying, Hispanic people, the people that spoke Spanish, were just like, they just felt really seen, and I think they we just got really good feedback, and every single time now it's like, when are we going to do that again? Like, we really want that, the whole church. And we have a couple who have been really involved with helping Afghanistan refugees that have been coming, and so we've had other people that speak Swahili and then Chinese. And so we've just, one of the other goals that we have moving forward now is incorporating more languages to be spoken to. So, and like you said, I think it does it. The one thing I know that sometimes we can get a lot of flack for it in terms of like telling our stories during sermons, or like, I know like a lot of mainline people were like, oh, we don't, like, you shouldn't tell your story. It should be all about scripture or whatever. But I think one of the real benefits of that is that you do get to hear people's perspectives on how the gospel is touching their lives personally. And that is, I think that's really beneficial for the church to hear that. So this is providing that space for people to share with us how they see and experience the gospel and grace and Jesus and stuff, you know?
Yeah, so that's interesting. One of the first sacramental, I mean, like clearly charismatic sacramental spaces I ever had was in Nepal, which this kind of gets to the different languages thing. I'll get to it, but so I go in 2009. Nepal had gone from being a Hindu monarchy for like 200 or 500 years like that to becoming a democratic republic or whatever. And so we go over there and we're helping start this Bible college, and I was teaching all these Christology and hermeneutics courses for like 3 weeks. And while we're there, we traveled to this region of the Himalayas called Chitwan, and we're there and we went and attended this. It was the coolest thing. It was like a Korean Presbyterian Baptist church because Koreans and Baptists Presbyterians and Baptists from Korea had partnered together to start this or to fund this church. It was just the coolest thing, because Presbyterians and Baptists obviously have a lot in common, but yeah, but then there's also the baptism difference.
Baptism problem.
Yeah. So anyway, I just thought it was cool. So we go there and we walked into the church service. It had gotten through its music, and they were about to move into celebrating communion. And so they asked us to be a part of that. And I remember I was in this room. It was no bigger than my office right here, but there was probably 150 people in it, just all on the floors. And we had to like kind of, and I get up front and they're like, would you pray? And I was like, absolutely. I'd be honored to pray. And I looked down to see what they're, just to see the elements. And it was interesting because there's basically a bag of pita chips, more or less. And then they had like the Nepali version of Kool-Aid, grape drink, or, And at first I was like, oh, that's interesting. But what they did as part of the service, they like pulled out the bag. I mean, it was so ritualistic and sacred. It was very interesting because they had this bag of like pita chips and like slowly poured it into this basket, scoops of the grape drink powder, stirred it. It was all like part of the service, and very, very, very honoring. I mean, it was like the preparation, because it's interesting how, there's some people who are like, oh, you can only use X, Y, Z, but it was like, no, it's the fruit of the vine that matters. This is the common, bread of this culture, right? So it kind of rooted that Eucharistic experience in the Nepali culture. It wasn't like it has to be. Yeah, so it was just really cool. I totally got. I mean, you could sense the presence of God. So charismatics right now listening, just it was very charismatic. Like goosebumps.
But wait, you
butterflies.
So you can be charismatic and ritualistic at the same time, is what I'm hearing you say. Exactly. That's pretty.
I know. It was amazing. Yeah, and so, cool. But what was, and then they, I think I prayed in English or something like that. But I think this is kind of connected to different languages. Is that there was something really powerful and beautiful in seeing the other culture, leaning into this. For me, I mean, that was one of the most formative. That was one of the first times that I was like, okay, there's something going on in the Eucharist. Yeah, it's because before that I'd always been, zwingli symbolism. It's all a sign, it's all symbols. It's all spiritual, without any, substantial reality in the now. But anyway, so I just think that's another aspect of that. Different languages, which then provides a context for different cultures to come through. I think it's important for Americans of all stripes, white, black, yellow, green, whatever color, whatever ethnic group we are. I think it's important for all Americans to see that the Eucharist is not capsulated in an American cultural thing. It's not like, I mean, because even like, man, another thing that I would add on to that is going to a Seder, going to a Jewish Seder is probably one of the most important. And if you can, in some way, shape, or form, go to one that is as close to the original context as you can be, would be really amazing. Where you're reclining, just getting to see how different that experience was in Jesus' the Last Supper. Because it was clearly a Seder. When you read the Gospel of Luke, you'll notice that, I think it's in the Gospel of Luke, that there's a couple cups that are drank. Yeah. And so there's multiple cups that are in the Seder meal. So anyway, Yeah, so I think that's another part about the different languages is that does help flesh out the various cultural contexts in which the gospel is still applicable. That's what I think, is beautiful about that. So,
yeah, totally.
Okay, number five, man, this is probably one that'll be interesting to talk about.
Well, this is probably more for you because you have implemented this. I mean, we've only done one litany and one lament, and we did it when we did it when America withdrew from Afghanistan. And I don't know if you remember those scenes and visuals. And we had a lot of Afghan refugees that were literally in our church as a result of that. And so we decided to provide a space to do a litany and lament during that time period, and it was very powerful. And I was really nervous because it was the first litany that we did as a church, and I was like, "Oh, people are going to hate this. How are people going to respond?" And so we decided to do. And this is the other thing: like litanies don't need to be very long and drawn out; they can be short, and you don't need to do that at the beginning. So I just did a very short one, and so that was the primary space that we did a litany and lament, and we had a really positive response, and people really resonated with it, and we're really thankful that we recognized what was happening. So that's another space that the table actually can create space for, is if there is something where you need a space to lament or you need a space to do that, the table's prime for that.
So your number 5 is that you say that the Eucharist provides space for litanies and laments. So why don't you define for, someone who's coming from maybe a more charismatic background, they're like, what is a litany? That sounds weird. How would you describe a litany or define it?
Well, I suppose that might give the most accurate picture of what people might think of as like a call and response. So like when you go into a Catholic church or something, and there's the priest or someone up front is saying a portion or is saying words, and then everyone says written words up on the screen together. And pretty much it's where everyone is involved in the prayer or the reading of scripture. It involves the whole church. You would probably be able to speak more to that. But
I'm not a litanist, but I think that you're right. It's traditionally it's a set of prayers is I think a good way to say it, where leaders will lead a section of prayer and then the congregation will respond. So it's petitions. Historically, it's been looked at as petitions.
Yeah, I would say it's petitions. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also, in some traditions, for certain charismatic folks, especially those who have maybe been attached to, the International House of Prayer and Mike Bickle and the IHOP world, harp and bowl style of worship, features a lot of antiphonal singing, which is like this response. So like oftentimes in that set, someone will read a passage of scripture, a psalm or a portion of Revelation, and then people will like prophetically sing prophetic worship. So it's just so when we're talking about litanies, is in the context of the Eucharist, is in addition to maybe reading a passage of scripture, sharing a devotion, and then receiving, there's also a space where maybe before you receive or after you receive, there's a prepared set of words that help, I'm going to say the word anchor again, help anchor the congregation in a theme or in a passage of scripture. So we use litanies. We have not been really great the last month and a half about using them, but we've been doing it about every week prior to that. So we've been using a really, really helpful resource for finding litanies is a book by Winfield Bevins called Living Room Liturgy. Great book. And that's been really helpful. It's got tons of litanies in it, and, about anything. So we have actually connected our litanies less to the Eucharist and more to worship, our music, our singing. So like after the second or third song, we'll have a prayer for spiritual friendship or other churches or Thanksgiving, whatever it would be. So,
that's cool.
Yeah. The laments thing, not thing, it sounds like that thing. But I think that's tough for a lot of us to do in America. Well, because we don't lament well, and we don't even have a theology for it. It seems like,
Yeah, and it's well in America, and then also in charismatic worlds too. It's
Totally.
not there's like a double whammy there, where there's not a lot of space to recognize just that side of theology and faith and everything. So
Yeah.
I think you can combine them. And again, the table is a great space because at the table you're recognizing both Jesus's death and resurrection. And so there is that space if you want to lean into what it means to lament and be sorrowful and grieve and all of that. There is that space, and it makes a lot of sense,
How would you define? Let's talk about lamenting just a little bit, because it seems like, when you kind of dabble into the sacramental charismatic tapestry and you're starting to lean into that a little bit, you're going to start reading folks who talk a lot about contemplative prayer and, and those contemplative traditions. I mean, Dallas Willard, obviously, for a lot of people has been the gateway drug, in the vineyard to that. But like for me, Dallas Willard, I've been thinking about, we should someday do an episode on Dallas Willard and why I'm suspicious.
Oh, nice. Okay.
I'll be controversial.
Okay.
I love Dallas Willard, but I also am suspicious of him a little bit. Not him, obviously, because he's passed away.
Yeah.
But I just think there's things about Dallas Willard that I think we should talk about. And one of them is there's seemingly I don't know, it's always like his sacramentality is absent and it's missing.
It is.
And so,
totally.
It just feels like that's, I don't know. I've always felt like there's a framework or a foundation missing in some of his theological, oftentimes philosophy, right? More than anything. But so I've always kind of been a little suspicious. And my observation is not all, but most of the hardcore Dallas Willard, like Willard is, the second coming of John Wimber. I mean, Jesus, it's like, there's just not a lot of embodiment or, like doing the stuff. It's just a lot of, I don't know, like talking about the spiritual disciplines more than doing the spiritual disciplines.
I think we totally should talk about it because he's been so influential in the vineyard, but yet no one really talks about how influential he is.
Yeah.
But we talk about it, but just like, okay, how is he influencing our stuff? So I think we really should. I totally agree. I also think he's going to run into the problem of like Calvin, of like what Calvin actually said versus what people. I think that's true probably too. Because I remember at once, like after he did it, he stopped talking about using the word spiritual disciplines because he hated it already, what it had become. I think there's a lot of that too.
Habits.
Yeah. And there's like, I feel like whenever I read or hear him talk, he's constantly having to qualify like I don't mean this, I don't mean that, or stuff like that.
Toward the end of his life. Yeah. He's just like, no,
stop. Yeah. Oh gosh. So I do
actually, you know what? Maybe we need to do an episode where we critique the Dallas Willard disciple.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Not Dallas
absolutely.
Willard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so mean.
Yeah.
So mean.
But anyways,
so mean.
So mean. But I think we should totally do that. let's do that. Let's make that an episode.
Yeah.
So
lamenting.
So lamenting. Yeah. So I don't even know what to say anymore about that. But
well, define
always
it.
To say
again. What is a lament? Like,
well, I think
real clear.
Well, it's for me. It's lamenting is always expressive of grief or sorrow, or being sorrowful. So there's a lot of things at play. It's not like one dimensional. It can reflect different aspects of a life that is pretty much being touched by grief or just being sorrowful. It recognizes the fact that not everything is about being on a spiritual high, but there is parts of life where we are in a valley, and that could be for many different reasons. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel angry. It's, all those emotions are okay to feel, and we need to provide space for that. Like no one's going to go to the, I was going to say, like, when Jesus is dying on the cross and his mom's there, like, even like Jesus didn't stop her from grieving, knowing that he was going to be resurrected, and instead he pointed her to community, and he pointed her to John and said, "This is now your mother," So he didn't try to say, "Oh, don't worry, I'm going to be in heaven," which is what often happens, or "Don't worry, everything's going to be okay." He didn't take that away from her. Instead, he pointed her to the church, pretty much.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think pastors need to hear that, because I think we are, as Americans, maybe, and maybe as Western Christians, we're really uncomfortable with grieving and sorrow. And it's almost like we're conditioned to assume that being sad is a sin, or at least it's really close to it. And yet, I mean, I was just thinking about Lazarus with Jesus. Jesus wept. I mean, that's the most profound.
Exactly.
It's always, when I was growing up, it's like, what's your favorite Bible verse?
Yeah.
Jesus wept. I can remember that one. Yeah. But it's so profound that if Jesus wept, not cried, wept. It's a profound concept to think about God in the flesh weeping. So that seems to indicate, I think, that if Jesus did it, it's okay.
Exactly.
It's okay to be sad, and, so how many times have I think pastors mean well, or, people mean well when they're trying to comfort people, but it's like, it's not helpful and it's not comforting to tell people to stop grieving or stop being sad. And be happy, oh, be happy. Just joy of the Lord is your strength. It's like using biblical words and verses and phrases to undermine other biblical realities too. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
It's, again, I think there's a way to grieve and to experience sorrow and to weep while still being faithful to Jesus. And, I think people need to know that that's true, but also pastors and church leaders and just people who are in the church who want to be a help need to remember that too, because sometimes the most helpful thing we can do is just be present for people while they're in the midst of you do that as a vocation now, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's our job, is to, as a chaplain, I'm recognizing and I'm helping people be seen in their grief by being with them. And that's what you want to do. You want, like, people want to know that it's okay to grieve, and they want to know that someone is willing to go through that with them and not run away. Because when someone says, "Oh, like, hey, it's going to be better," it's telling, all that says to me is that they can't handle the grief. Like, they're not comfortable with it.
Yeah. Which is super common.
And by the way, it's okay. Like, if you're really struggling to do that, that's like, it's also super okay. Just be honest with the person. Just be like, this is really hard for me to do this right now. I'm going to be with you, but just so you know, this is really hard for me. Yeah. Just be authentic with them.
Yeah, I think, and also, being honest and saying, hey, I just need to not be around right now, like, because I think everybody grieves in different ways. Some people I don't know. Like some people, they have no problem grieving publicly, and other people are like, yeah, no, I'm going to go in my,
this. Yeah.
I'm going to go in my room and
Yeah.
I'm going to just let it all. I when my dad, who I just got to spend, it was so cool. I got to spend, a week, up in Alaska with my family. I got to do my cousin's wedding. And perform the ceremony for that, and then spend some time. I had to go fish. It's so stupid.
Sorry,
but,
man.
It forced me into it. Yeah, my real vocation. And then, but I got to spend some time with my dad and my mom, and I was watching my dad as we were in this area of Alaska called Talkeetna, and just could see Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley. It's the largest mountain. Denali is the largest mountain in North America. And you could see it's just massive. And my dad was standing there outside, and I was watching him, and I was just thinking how 2 years ago, my dad had just found out he had cancer. He had been, really trying to figure out what was going on for like 6 months. And we all I was watching him go through chemo, and it was really scary because, I was pretty much seeing the amount of pain. I was like, this is not good. And they kind of said, it's, you might be 2 years. And they kind of threw some numbers out there that were really disheartening. And when I first found out, though, I remember I had been guiding. So, I also guide on the side for fly fishing trips, and, get paid crazy money to row people around. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if it's a side thing anymore, though.
Yeah. It's like, I know. I'm like, oh, can I just be a pastor on Sundays? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, that's the beauty of co-pastoring, which that could be a whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I had been guiding. I came over the mountain, and I got all these text messages from my whole family because we've been a part of this text thread. And that's when I found out my dad had stage 4 kidney cancer. And like in the next hour, I swear to you, I went through all 5 stages of grief. I was like, it was seriously like losing it, and then like denial, and then anger, and then, but it was like, I needed to do that by myself. I don't think I could have done that with anybody else.
Yeah.
I think it would have been unhelpful to me to have somebody there. So it was later on when I was able to, I had kind of processed through some of that. It was then really helpful to have people, to process things.
Totally.
But yeah. So I just think
no, totally. And we have this saying too, like in chaplaincy, like a ministry of absence can be just as helpful. Like recognizing that someone doesn't want us there is part of it, and like going, you just need to be by yourself right now. I can see, or whatever. So that totally makes sense. And I was just thinking now, just in terms of that, and I think someone that had, I've spoken to you about him, but someone that has just like so shaped my idea of like what it means to die recently is an Orthodox theologian named John Bear. And just thinking about how for us charismatics, we so often think, like, I'm thinking about your dad and what he's going through, and if we saw that he was healed, we would see that as like a victory. And I don't want to say that wouldn't be a victory, and I don't want to say that wouldn't be a sign of God's glory and working in him and stuff like that. But it's like, your dad's still going to die. We're all still going to die, And I sometimes feel like we put death as far away as possible in charismatic circles, and we just try not to think about it. But death is central to being human. And so anyway, that's a side tangent that we should.
It's somehow it's connected to our theology of the kingdom, because our theology of the kingdom, it's not yet in consummation stage, right? So there is this not yet aspect still, to where, everybody is going to die. It's part of the season of the kingdom that we're in, Doesn't mean there's not miracles. Doesn't mean that we can't pray for the sick to be, healed, or the dead to be raised. And sometimes God does those things, but we also need to not, so the question, the tantamount question about the kingdom is, how is God present in the midst of suffering, death, disease, when you feel like God is absent, how is God present? That has been the centering question that has been in the back of my mind as a pastor for a long time, because it's like, surely God is still at work right now, So number six.
Yeah.
Number six. We've been so liturgical and lamental. Let's talk about number six.
Well, I would say this is something that just happened a couple of weeks ago, and it was more tied to worship, but it went from instead of going straight from worship into the table, we transitioned from worship into ministry time into the table. And it just helped me see that the Spirit is involved in that process too. And so, like, anticipating the table involved a charismatic experience where the Spirit was just really present with us, and we just made space for people to receive prayer before we went to the table. And so I think that's part of what the Spirit can be doing at the table too. And I know you have a really good story about someone receiving healing and stuff at the table, I think, right? But that popped up into my mind too, just how the table can invite those experiences, and that can happen.
Yeah, I think, for listeners to think about this biblically, how do we arrive at that scenario? So I mentioned earlier the book Forgotten Power by William D. Ortega is a practical and theological resource to kind of flesh out this approach. But biblically speaking, when you look at 1 Corinthians, arguably the greatest passage in the Bible on spiritual gifts, 1 Corinthians 12 or 14. 13 obviously is important in that context too, right? Because if every spiritual gift isn't exercised in love, then it's a waste of time. So Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians, and he's trying to correct and to teach them about spiritual gifts. I mean, he even says that, I wish I had no reason to write you, but I need to clarify some things. So when Paul writes that letter, though, he doesn't, have chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 2, right? He has no chapter headings. So it's just one letter. And so, when you're reading the argument, essentially, Paul in chapter 10 begins to talk about the Eucharist a bit. He talks about sharing in the cup of the Lord, which is where we get this idea of he uses the word koinonia in the context of the Lord's Supper, and koinonia can be translated as fellowship or partnership, right? It's a sharing together. And then he goes into this, he launches off into chapter 12 where he lays out his theology of the Eucharist, so essentially. And then also, which is, by the way, is interesting that Paul says, I received this from the Lord Jesus himself. So I just want to point out.
That's a big claim.
Yeah, like this is pretty significant because, so let me just back up. Saul is killing Christians or at least ordering Christians to be killed. And then he has his road to Damascus experience, becomes converted to Christianity, or Messianic Judaism, take your pick.
Yeah.
And then we read pretty quickly that he's like planting churches, but there's actually this period of about 12 years between Paul becoming a follower of Jesus and then becoming like part of the ministry team, right? So he spent some time in Saudi Arabia, in the desert, and he notes several times that he has encounters with Jesus where Jesus speaks to him, right? And so I think in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is saying, hey, Jesus himself told me how important the Eucharist is. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying. He's not saying Peter told me, the other apostles told me. He said, I received this from the Lord Jesus himself. That right there, to me, is like nail in the coffin against anybody who would say that the centrality of the Eucharist is not that important. Like, it is.
Yeah.
Paul says so.
Yeah.
Okay. Off tangent.
Nice.
Rant over. Okay. So 1 Corinthians 11, Paul lays out his theology of the Eucharist. He corrects some of the abuses that are happening in Corinth. And then he seamlessly transitions into about now concerning spiritual gifts, right? So for Paul, there is not a separation of Eucharist and then charismatic, right? And so I think what you're suggesting is if you're leaning into the sacramental charismatic world, the tapestry, we should not like try to have mutually exclusive categories or have like, well, this is, sacramental time right here, and then you've got charismatic time here. It's like, no, like we need to blend these together. And so in the same way that we should be sensitive to the Holy Spirit leading us at the end of the service with prophetic direction, we should also be sensitive to that during the Eucharist, because if we view the Eucharist as a space where we are encountering the presence of Jesus through his Spirit, if it is a space for the Holy Spirit to be at work, we can have, to use John Wimber's language, we can have gracelets in the form of spiritual gifts show up. And so I think that's really great that you're saying it is a space where people, perhaps you receive prayer before you receive communion. But that's the great story of that book, Forgotten Power, is that the author tells this story about how, like, as they were about to receive the Eucharist, like people started speaking in tongues and started like people got prayer and were healed miraculously, and all this prophetic stuff was happening. It's pretty cool.
No, totally. And I really like your point, and the fact that Paul doesn't see a different, like, it's quite radical because it's not dualistic. For Paul, it's one. It's like, this is like a new world that incorporates the spiritual and this material world that is both meaningful and both interact. And we shouldn't divorce the two. So I think that's a really good point.
Let's avoid that mistake. It's essentially what Paul is getting at, So, and I just, it's like, that's why for the sacramentalist type person, I think those folks, I think the common journey here for somebody is to be charismatic, who likes theology, who starts reading some sacramental stuff, is like, hey, this sounds real similar to other areas of theology, like, oh, and then all of a sudden it's like the blinders come off and you see it's all seamlessly intertwined. Probably not as common for people who are sacramental who then become charismatic. But for those folks, it's the same thing. It's like, you've got all the framework. So now take that sacramental tapestry or lens and now apply it to all the other spaces for the Spirit to work, like laying hands on somebody and asking the Holy Spirit to heal them, But I think for the common person, it's like, hey, your charismatic experience doesn't have to just be at the end of the service. It can be over here,
I mean, I told you, I don't know if this is a charismatic experience, but when I sold my bicycle, so just to tell everyone else, I thought this was so great. So I sold, we just moved and I sold one of my bicycles. Well, it was Irene's. But we sold it to this Trappist monk who came and said, he was like, I was doing that thing on social media. I don't know what you call it. He was like, I was looking at your page, and I was like, stalking? He's like, yes, that's it. He was like, I was stalking your Facebook profile, because he bought it through Facebook Marketplace. And he was like, I listened to your podcast, your Sacramental Charismatic podcast. And he was like, the lights went off. He was like, I've been a monk for 20 years now. And I was like, duh. He was like, I didn't think about the fact that the table can be the place that unites all the streams of the church. And for him, it was just like this moment where he was like, how have I been so blind to the fact that the table can include the Baptists, the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Pentecostals? He was like, we can all come to Jesus's table. And so anyways, I just thought it was like so cool that we got that affirmation from a Trappist monk,
Yeah, awesome.
and he even said, he was like, you guys were probably more theological than I am. And I was like, what?
You're like,
what?
Oh.
Yeah.
That's when you say, oh, dear Lord.
I know. I was like, oh, no. So anyways, I think that again, it includes this other element where the table can just bring the whole church together, So anyways.
That's good. Awesome. All right. Well, we're at number 7. Yeah, number 7.
This is nothing, just ending off with saying we're leading into receiving Jesus's grace and his kingdom story every single week. And I think what we've touched on is that there's different aspects that can be touched on every single week. Like I remember when I first posted something on Facebook, I got this message from, I'm not going to say who it is, but I got this message from someone who was like, those things you've written about the Eucharist is great, but the central theme is on I can't even remember, but he said, this is it. Like the central theme is God's sacrifice for us. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll redo my whole thesis and theology degree then. But I think what we are invited to is that this does display different aspects of the kingdom. And that's what's so beautiful about it. Does it one week we can have a charismatic experience, another week we can have a lament and a litany, another week we can have someone invited to follow Jesus for the first time, another week we can talk about the fact that we're actually anchored by the future coming of the kingdom, where we will have a final feast with Jesus. That's what Jesus talks about when he's doing thing, so there's all these different things that it's impossible to encapsulate all of them in one week. And instead we've got this whole years and years in which we can continually display the different beautiful aspects of the kingdom story.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is like receiving Jesus's grace. That is a huge, huge deal, and it's radical. Receiving Jesus's grace is no small feat, and it's life-changing. And that's also the beautiful thing, is like leading people to the table is life-changing. And we're encountering Jesus, we're encountering the risen Christ, we're receiving his grace. And that is anchoring for our souls, so.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like what you're saying about the different, like the different themes. I like to use the word theme, I think, when it comes to Eucharist.
Yeah.
Because like, what's the Eucharist about?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, well, it's about the death of Jesus. Okay. Well, what's the death of Jesus about?
Jesus,
yeah. Myriad of I like that analogy people have used about how it's the diamond, held in the light. Like people, the patristics talk about how Scripture was like a diamond. If you hold it in the light, you can turn it and see these different beautiful lights. So I think that with the themes, like, right, how many themes are there about the Eucharist? I mean, I could 7 easily could come up with 7.
Yeah.
Think a little bit harder. 9, 10, 11, 12. And so I like when we're led into receiving Jesus' grace and his kingdom story every single week. Yeah, the Eucharist have that space again as an opportunity to lean into all these different themes. I mean, it's about the forgiveness that God extends to us. It's about, I mean, gosh, how could you deny that it's not about anticipating the marriage supper of the Lamb? It's about, having peace with God. It's about substitution, God's substitution in Jesus. There's just so many different, I mean, even one theme that I think we kind of, I know the word social justice now is thrown around a lot, and to the point where it's like, I don't even know what it means sometimes when I hear it all the time, but justice, let's just say God's justice, there's definitely an aspect of that too, because in 1 Corinthians 11, it's interesting. Paul basically says, hey, make sure that everybody in the church gathering has an opportunity to receive. Like, let's be fair, quote unquote.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't use the word fair, but so you have this theme about how God's desire is so that everybody would have an opportunity, to experience grace. I mean, that gets to the heart of the kingdom too, of his desire to extend mercy, to extend grace. He's eager to be known and experienced. So all these different themes, I mean, again, you could just come up with so many themes seem to be helpful. And I should add, we'll put this in the description here, that little booklet that I wrote on communion.
Yeah.
I don't even remember the name of it right now, but I'll have a PDF in this, but when I wrote that, it has 7 different themes, little devotionals that can kind of get you, thinking about that. So if you're looking to become a sacramental charismatic and you want to start celebrating the Eucharist in a more substantial, rooted way, that could help, guide that along. So but I love that, you being able to lead people into the story of the kingdom. That's a good.
I think, yeah. And by the way, you should also link the liturgy book that you mentioned, the living room liturgy.
Link every book we've mentioned in this today.
There we go. And yeah, I would actually change that. I would say we're led into receiving Jesus's grace and participating in his kingdom story. I think that would be one word I would change, but yeah, it's still the same. Yeah, and we didn't speak about the challenges, but there are challenges. There are challenges into
speak about it.
Well, I think just leading through it and it takes time. You have to just be intentional about it, and that takes time. And you've got to carve out time in your week to think about that. There's going to be some emails you're going to get from people asking why we're doing this, and they're going to want to know why we're doing it every week and once a month. They prefer once a month. It's going to become less meaningful.
It's very easy response to that. Just send them a picture of the Bible. That right there.
Perfect.
Just kidding.
And then, or just be like, I didn't realize, and just ask them if they feel the same about preaching, if we should preach only once a month then.
Yeah.
So I think that
to clarify, don't do those things. Pastor your people through it.
Do that. Yeah.
Help them. We're being snarky. Yeah. I mean, but also another drawback from doing this is that you're potentially going to lose people.
Totally. And I would also say this. I mean, we experienced this in our church plant where we spoke about the fact that we were going to do communion every week, and we got a lot of enthusiastic responses from people who probably wouldn't join the Vineyard, who are maybe more reformed or more liturgical, and then they be part of it, and then they realize that we're not doing it the same way as like maybe they're used to, and they might not like that. And I was talking about this with someone recently, and a lot of people mistake Vineyard's flexibility in theology with uncertainty. Yeah. And I think that you might encounter that, or confusion. Yeah.
Like we're confused.
Yeah. Like we're confused. No, we're being very intentional about holding the tensions constantly. So that would be it. I'm trying to think what else. Surprisingly, it hasn't required a ton more volunteering on a Sunday morning in terms of laying out the elements. You can make it very simplified and not complicated at all. So, yeah, and there's obviously it's going to probably be clunky in the beginning, and it's not going to be smooth and all of that, and that's totally okay. That's also part of being on the journey and being with the church and stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we maybe we need to think. I haven't even thought about a whole lot about what are some of the drawbacks to, but I think maybe one to just say that this is probably a big can of worms that we could talk about later, but is the tensions, being a sacramental charismatic person who starts weaving the celebration and remembrance of Eucharist into the life of the church requires tension, and we are not very good at keeping tensions as human beings. We're not very good as Americans, I think, or Western people. It seems like there's an aspect where it's somewhat paradoxical, right? It seems like it's a paradox to be a sacramental charismatic.
Yeah.
Like people are like, what is that? What
Yeah.
does that mean? So that can be challenging because it does require a level of commitment and a level of reflection, and building that into the life of the church seems to be challenging and seems to take some work. And that goes back to, it's not going to be for everybody. I mean, that's why this cannot be, to me, this can't be well, I want to grow our church, so let's become sacramental charismatic people. Because it might do the opposite.
Yeah.
I think if you lead it well and you take the time to pastor people in it and through it, then it's definitely possible to continue a sustained growth. But it's a lot of work. I mean, for the most part, we've had, I'd say overwhelmingly, 95 to 98% of any feedback I ever hear, which is only a small part, obviously, but has been a lot of positive. Like most of our congregations love the litanies and all those things. But then there's this, 1 to 2% of people who are like, it's Catholic, and they have no, they don't have a framework to understand why that is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's like, okay, well, I mean, that the litany thing is, I know we need to do a whole episode on that to address some of these things, but it's like crazy to me that someone would have a problem with, I mean, when you think about it, they actually have a problem with praying prepared prayers when the Bible is full of prayers that are prepared, that the church has been praying for 2,000 years. Like, to me, that's like, okay, this is not a problem that we can really fix, because you need to really think a little bit about your theology and what you're opposed to. It sounds to me like that's more of a responding to past, issues from your past church experience rather than actually having a problem with what is a problem,
Yeah.
It's nonsensical to me.
Well, I mean, like at most basic, it's then you can't say the prayer that Jesus told his disciples to pray because it's prepared.
Yeah, well, no, and that's what's interesting, is that some of those people have a problem with praying the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, Jesus told us to, but we
have a problem here, Houston.
Yeah.
We have a problem. So,
yeah.
Actually, hey, for those of you listening, great way to get into litanies is, again, that book, the Living Room Liturgy, because what we do every single time we include a litany in our service, we close by praying the Lord's Prayer every single time, and that's been a good.
And people are like, they know it, and it's not too foreign.
Although, do you remember the first time I don't know if you were at our vineyard here when we first, no, I don't think you were yet. I remember the first Sunday that I had our congregation pray the Lord's Prayer, and that we had gone, like, I think our church had gone from like 35 to, like, at that time, about 220 people within like 2 months or whatever. Yeah. And like literally out of our 210 people in the room, it was like 7 of them knew the Lord's Prayer. It was so interesting to me because I had been in a congregation for 12 years that we prayed it all the time, so it's just like people were like,
what is this?
And the person who I had lead it didn't even know the traditional cadence, of Our Father.
Oh, wow.
They were like, Our Father who art in heaven, and hallowed be.
So good. Oh my gosh, I love that so much. Oh, that's
it was
the best.
Amazing. Yeah, it was pretty cool. So anyway, hey,
awesome.
It's been a super fun. Yeah. So let's do an episode in the next 4 months. We'll.
Hey, maybe this will create more demand. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
4 people out there trying to. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. Hey, folks, it would be super helpful for us if you would like, comment, share this episode, and leave a review on the Apple Store. That would be awesome. I think that actually helps with getting more listens and things like that.
Like questions too. If you have questions, and
send them to Wes. Yes, good idea.
Yeah. My email is lukegarrity@gmail.com. Yeah, so,
Automatically deleted.
yeah. Man.
Great. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, hey, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you as soon as we jump back on the next episode.